Ashenmeres Secret. Lady Rosamund of Whitmore had been raised to be the perfect noblewoman, obedient and silent. But when she was given to Sir Hugh Fitzalan, the battle-worn knight feared for his past, she saw hesitation in his gaze. "You do not want this marriage," he murmured. "Then why do you look at me as if you do?" Chapter 1. The Reluctant Bridegroom. The heavy oak door of the Whitmore Great Hall creaked open, admitting a shaft of weak, late autumn sunlight that momentarily banished the gloom. Lady Rosamund of Whitmore, her fingers numb with cold despite the thick fur lining of her sleeves, watched as Sir Hugh Fitzalan entered. He moved with the controlled grace of a seasoned warrior, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his chainmail glinting dully in the flickering torchlight. He was a figure sculpted from granite and shadow, a man who had seen too much of war, too much of death. His dark hair, threaded with the silver of premature aging, framed a face etched with lines of hardship, a stark contrast to the smooth, unblemished skin of the younger knights who milled about the hall, eager for their midday meal. Rosamund's breath hitched. This was the man to whom she was now bound, a stranger whose life was a tapestry woven with threads of battle and bloodshed, a life so utterly different from her own sheltered existence within Whitmore's ancient walls. She had been raised to be the perfect noblewoman, obedient, silent, a vessel for her family's ambitions. Her needlepoint was flawless, her prayers punctual, her demeanor demure. Yet, beneath the surface of placid obedience, a quiet rebellion simmered. She yearned for more than the gilded cage of her noble birth, for a purpose beyond the endless cycle of feasts and festivals, prayers and pregnancies. Sir Hugh paused before her father, Lord Elric of Whitmore, a man whose girth spoke of years of indulgence and whose eyes, though aged, still held the glint of shrewd calculation. Lord Elric clapped Hugh on the shoulder, a gesture that seemed more possessive than welcoming. "Fitzalan," he boomed, his voice echoing through the hall. "Welcome to Whitmore. My daughter awaits." Rosamund lowered her gaze, a blush warming her cheeks. She felt Hugh's eyes upon her, heavy and assessing. She dared to steal a glance, meeting his gaze for the briefest of moments. His eyes were a startling shade of gray-blue, like the winter sky before a storm, and within their depths she saw not the eager anticipation of a bridegroom, but a profound weariness, a haunting sadness that tugged at something deep within her. The wedding ceremony in the chapel had been a blur of Latin chants, the scent of incense thick in the air, and the cold weight of the Fitzalan family ring on her finger. The ring, a heavy band of gold adorned with a rearing lion, felt alien and constricting. She had repeated her vows in a voice that barely trembled, her hand clasped in Hugh's. His hand was calloused and scarred, a testament to his life as a warrior, a life that now included her. Now, in the great hall, the feasting had begun. Roasted meats, spiced wine, and honeyed cakes adorned the long tables, but Rosamund had little appetite. She sat beside Hugh at the high table, a vast expanse of polished oak separating them. The noise of the revelry, the boisterous laughter and clatter of goblets, seemed to press in on her, suffocating her. Hugh ate sparingly, his gaze fixed on his plate. He spoke little, answering her father's questions with curt nods and monosyllabic replies. Rosamund watched him, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. This was not the joyous union she had been led to expect, not the fairy tale ending whispered about in the ladies' chambers. This was a marriage of convenience, a strategic alliance forged between two powerful families, with her as the pawn. As the afternoon wore on, the shadows in the hall lengthened. The minstrels began to play a lively tune, and some of the younger guests rose to dance. Rosamund remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt Hugh shift beside her, his chain-mail rustling softly. "You are quiet, my lady," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Rosamund turned to him, surprised by the gentleness in his tone. "As befits a new bride, Sir Knight," she replied, her voice barely audible above the music. He studied her for a moment, his gaze searching. "As befits a woman who has been given to a stranger," he corrected, a hint of bitterness lacing his words. He sighed, the sound heavy with unspoken burdens. "You do not want this marriage." It was not a question, but a statement of fact. Rosamund's heart pounded in her chest. She had been taught to conceal her emotions, to present a facade of serene acceptance, but his words, so direct and unexpected, stripped away her carefully constructed composure. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not just the battle-hardened knight, but the man beneath the armor, a man burdened by a past he could not escape. And in that moment, a flicker of defiance ignited within her. "Then why do you look at me as if you do?" The words, soft but tinged, slipped, revealing her curiosity and a strange defiance she hadn't known she possessed. The music seemed to fade, the noise of the hall receding into a distant hum. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, a silent acknowledgement of the chasm that separated them, and the faint, almost imperceptible spark of something else, something that could either bridge that chasm or widen it into an unbreachable abyss. He did not immediately reply, his eyes instead taking note to a small stain on the table and his finger work, tracing the rim of the cup he had been handed. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Whitmore Chapel. The following morning dawned gray and overcast, mirroring Rosamund's mood. She had slept little, the unfamiliar weight of the Fitzalan ring on her finger a constant reminder of her new reality. The vast bedchamber, with its heavy tapestries and imposing furniture, felt more like a prison cell than a bridal suite. She rose, dressed in a simple gown of gray wool, and made her way to the chapel, seeking solace in the familiar rhythm of prayer. The chapel was small, tucked away in a quiet corner of the castle. The air was cold and still, scented with the lingering fragrance of incense and beeswax. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the stone floor. Rosamund knelt before the altar, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes fixed on the carved figure of the Virgin Mary. She tried to pray, to find comfort in the familiar words, but her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and apprehension. She was Lady Fitzalan now, mistress of a household she did not know, wife to a man who remained a stranger. The weight of her new responsibilities pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. She longed for the familiar comfort of her old life, for the gentle guidance of her mother, who had died when Rosamund was but a child. Her father, though loving in his own gruff way, had always been more concerned with the affairs of his estate than with the emotions of his daughter. As she knelt there, lost in her troubled thoughts, she heard a soft footfall behind her. She turned, expecting to see one of the castle servants, but it was Hugh. He stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the dim light. He was dressed not in his armor, but in a simple tunic and hose of dark blue, which somehow made him seem even more imposing. He hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether to intrude on her solitude, then entered the chapel, his steps silent on the stone floor. He knelt beside her, not too close, but close enough that she could feel the warmth emanating from his body. "I did not mean to disturb your prayers, my lady," he said, his voice low and respectful. Rosamund shook her head. "I find little peace in prayer this morning, Sir Knight," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. He was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the altar. "Marriage is a daunting prospect," he said finally, his voice tinged with a sadness that echoed her own. "Especially when it is arranged." Rosamund looked at him, surprised by his candor. She had expected him to maintain the facade of the stoic knight, to conceal his emotions behind a wall of indifference. But here, in the quiet sanctity of the chapel, he seemed different, more vulnerable. "My father believes it is a good match," she said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "A strong alliance between two powerful families." Hugh nodded. "That is what they all say," he murmured, his gaze shifting to the stained glass window, his eyes dark. He seemed to have trouble saying the words, his tone a soft, deep whisper. But alliances forged in the halls of power often crumble in the face of personal discord. Rosamund felt a shiver run down her spine. His words were ominous, hinting at a deeper conflict, a hidden truth that she could not yet grasp. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He turned to her, his gray-blue eyes searching her face. "Whitmore is a strong castle," he said, his voice low and intense. "But it is also isolated. You have enemies, my lady. Enemies who would see your family brought low." Rosamund's breath caught in her throat. She had always known that the world of noble politics was rife with intrigue and betrayal, but she had never felt personally threatened. Her life had been sheltered, protected within the walls of Whitmore. "Who?" she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Hugh hesitated, his gaze flickering towards the chapel door, as if afraid of being overheard. "There are whispers," he said, his voice barely audible. "Whispers of a conspiracy, a plot to seize your lands, to eliminate your family." Rosamund's heart pounded in her chest. The words were like a physical blow, shattering the illusion of safety she had always taken for granted. She looked at Hugh, her eyes pleading for answers, for reassurance. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers for a moment, before gently taking it. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his calloused fingers sending a shiver of warmth through her cold hand. "I will protect you, Rosamund," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "I swear it, upon my honor as a knight." His words, spoken with such conviction, should have reassured her, but they only served to deepen her unease. She saw the shadows in his eyes, the ghosts of his past that haunted him still. Could she trust him? Could she trust this stranger, this battle-worn knight, to keep her safe? The weight of the secrets and the whispers were the start of a great chain of events, one she knew not how to navigate. She squeezed his hand gently, a response that she had no time to ponder over, only to hope its meaning was well received. Chapter 3. The nights scarred past. The days following the wedding settled into a tense, uneasy rhythm. Rosamund found herself constantly observing Hugh, trying to decipher the man behind the stoic facade. He was courteous, even attentive, but there was a distance in his eyes, a wall he had erected between them. He spent much of his time overseeing the training of the Whitmore garrison, his presence a constant reminder of the potential threat that hung over them. One evening, after a particularly strange supper, Rosamund found Hugh standing alone on the castle battlements, gazing out at the darkening landscape. The wind whipped around him, tugging at his dark cloak, making him appear like a solitary sentinel against the encroaching night. She approached him cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the thick rushes that covered the stone floor. "The view is impressive," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind. He turned, startled by her presence. He had been so lost in his thoughts that he hadn't heard her approach. "It is," he replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "But beauty often hides danger." Rosamund shivered, not entirely from the cold. His words seemed to carry a deeper meaning, a veiled warning. She wrapped her arms around herself, seeking a warmth that the stone walls could not provide. "You speak of the whispers," she said, her gaze fixed on his profile. "The conspiracy you mentioned in the chapel." He nodded, his gaze returning to the landscape. "It is more than whispers, Rosamund. There are signs, movements in the shadows, alliances shifting like sand." Rosamund felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She wanted to ask him more, to demand details, but she hesitated, sensing his reluctance to reveal too much. "You seem to know a great deal about these matters," she said instead, her voice carefully neutral. He turned to her, his gray-blue eyes searching her face. "I have seen war, Rosamund," he said, his voice low and heavy. "I have seen the treachery of men, the lengths to which they will go for power and wealth." He paused, his gaze drifting towards the horizon, as if lost in a memory. "I was not always Sir Hugh Fitzalan," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was different once." Rosamund's heart quickened. She sensed that he was about to reveal something significant, something that lay at the heart of his guarded demeanor. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent. He hesitated, his hand reaching up to touch a scar that ran along his jawline, a thin, white line against his tanned skin. It was a scar she had noticed before, but had never dared to ask about. "I was betrothed," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "to a woman I loved deeply. Her name was Alara." Rosamund felt a pang of something. Jealousy? Pity? She wasn't sure. She had known, of course, that he must have had a life before her, but hearing him speak of a lost love, a woman he had cherished, made that past seem suddenly real, suddenly painful. What happened? She asked, her voice barely audible. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if the memory was too painful to bear. She was taken from me, he said, his voice raw with grief. Betrayed by those I trusted. Murdered by those who sought to destroy my family. Rosamund gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The horror of his story was palpable, a chilling reminder of the brutality of the world they lived in. She saw the pain etched on his face, the raw, unhealed wound that still festered within him. I am so sorry, she whispered, her voice filled with genuine compassion. He opened his eyes, his gaze meeting hers. That is why I am here, Rosamund, he said, his voice firm and resolute. To protect you. To ensure that what happened to Alara never happens to you. His words, spoken with such intensity, sent a shiver of both fear and something else through her. Gratitude? Hope? She wasn't sure. She only knew that in that moment, standing on the windswept battlements, she saw a glimmer of the man beneath the armor, a man who had known love and loss, a man who was determined to protect her, even at the cost of his own life. The wind continued to push at her, but his words served as an anchor. She had to know more. She had to know everything. But not now. Not yet. The wind, for the moment, served as the end to their conversation, but would be the start of many more. Chapter 4. A Falcon's Flight, a Lady's Hope. The next day, the weather cleared, revealing a sky of brilliant blue. Rosamund, seeking an escape from the stifling atmosphere of the castle, decided to visit the Mews. She had always loved the falcons, their fierce independence and graceful flight a stark contrast to her own constrained existence. She found Hugh there, standing beside the falconer, a hooded bird perched on his gloved hand. He was speaking in low tones to the man, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as she approached, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "My lady," he said, inclining his head in greeting. "I did not expect to see you here." I enjoy watching the falcons," Rosamund replied, her voice slightly hesitant. She felt awkward, unsure of her place in this world of men and birds of prey. Hugh nodded, his gaze shifting to the falcon on his hand. "They are magnificent creatures," he said. "Fierce, loyal, and free." Rosamund watched as he gently stroked the bird's feathers. She noticed the way his calloused fingers moved with such tenderness, a contrast to the harshness of his appearance. She wondered if he ever allowed himself to show such gentleness to humans. "This one is called Shadow," Hugh said, gesturing to the falcon. "He is my favorite." Rosamund looked at the bird, its dark plumage gleaming in the sunlight. It seemed to embody the same qualities she saw in Hugh: strength, resilience, and a hint of wildness. "May I see him fly?" she asked, her voice filled with a sudden longing. Hugh hesitated for a moment, then nodded.
"Of course," he said.
He signaled to the falconer, who removed the bird's hood. Hugh raised his arm, and with a powerful thrust of its wings, Shadow launched into the air. Rosamund watched, mesmerized, as the falcon soared upwards, circling higher and higher until it was nothing more than a speck against the vast blue sky. She felt a strange sense of exhilaration, a vicarious thrill at the bird's freedom. "He will return," Hugh said, his voice breaking through her reverie. "He is trained to the lure." Rosamund looked at him, her eyes questioning. "But what if he chooses not to?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Hugh smiled, a rare and fleeting expression that transformed his face. "Then he would be truly free," he said. "But he would also be alone." His words resonated with her, echoing her own internal conflict. She longed for freedom, for escape from the constraints of her noble birth, but she also feared the isolation that such freedom might bring. As they watched the falcon circle back towards them, Rosamund felt a sudden urge to confide in Hugh, to share her fears and hopes with him. But she hesitated, unsure of how he would react. She had been taught to keep her emotions hidden, to present a facade of serene acceptance. You miss your home, don't you? Hugh was the one to speak, watching her with a perceptive gaze. Rosamund was taken aback.
How did you know?
He gently retrieved Shadow, placing the hood back upon its head, settling the bird down. It is in your eyes. The same look that I saw the first day. It is the look of a bird, desperate to fly from its cage, but terrified of the vast sky. Rosamund felt a flush of warmth on her cheeks. Never had she been spoken to with such understanding. And you do feel trapped?
He looked away.
I have known little else. But unlike you, my lady, I have no gilded cage. Only the chains of the past that bind me. His words, so honest and raw, broke through her. She suddenly saw them both clearly, two birds trapped in their separate ways. One yearning for release, one bound by duty. She looked at him now, not as some stranger, but as a kindred spirit, a fellow prisoner. Perhaps, she said perhaps, we both need to find our lure. The statement hung between them. The falcon shifted, the horses neighed and kicked, and a distant clang was heard from the blacksmith. The statement stood alone, a promise of a conversation, of a future, of a bond. Hugh's response would guide what path this would take. Chapter 5. The Tournament of Shadows. Word arrived a week later that Lord Markham, a neighboring nobleman and a long-standing rival of the Whitmore family, was hosting a tournament. It was ostensibly a celebration of the harvest, but Rosamund suspected a more sinister motive. Tournaments were often used as a means of displaying power, of gauging the strength of one's enemies, and of forging alliances. Hugh, predictably, saw it as a potential threat. Markham is a treacherous cur, he said, his voice tight with anger. He would use any opportunity to undermine Whitmore. Lord Elric, however, was eager to attend. We cannot show weakness, he declared, his voice booming through the great hall. We must demonstrate our strength, our resolve. Rosamund, caught between her father's ambition and Hugh's caution, felt a growing sense of unease. She knew that the tournament was more than just a game, it was a dangerous dance of power, where reputations could be made or broken, and where lives could be lost. She voiced her concerns to Hugh, finding him in the armory, inspecting a newly forged sword. The air was thick with the smell of metal and oil, and the clang of the hammer on steel echoed through the chamber. I fear this tournament, she said, her voice low and troubled. I fear what Markham might plan. Hugh looked at her, his gray-blue eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. I will be there, Rosamund, he said, his voice firm. I will protect you and your family. His words, though reassuring, did little to ease her anxiety. She knew that Hugh was a skilled warrior, but she also knew that Markham was a cunning and ruthless opponent. The tournament grounds were a riot of color and activity. Banners fluttered in the breeze, tents were pitched in neat rows, and the air was filled with the sounds of music, laughter, and the clash of steel. Rosamund, dressed in a gown of deep blue velvet, sat beside her father in the raised viewing stand, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and dread. Hugh, clad in his full armor, his helmet adorned with a Fitzalan lion, looked every inch the formidable knight. He rode a magnificent black warhorse, its coat gleaming in the sunlight. Rosamund watched him, her breath catching in her throat. He was a figure of power and grace, a symbol of strength and protection in a world of chaos and uncertainty. The first day of the tournament was devoted to jousting. Hugh unseated several opponents with ease, his skill and strength evident to all. Rosamund watched, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and fear. She saw the way the other knights looked at him, their eyes filled with envy and respect. But she also saw the way Lord Markham watched him, his gaze cold and calculating. Markham was a large, imposing man, with a cruel face and a reputation for ruthlessness. He did not participate in the jousting himself, but his presence was a constant reminder of the underlying tension, the hidden threat that hung over the tournament. As the day wore on, the shadows lengthened, and the air grew cooler. The final joust was between Hugh and Sir Reginald, a knight known for his brutal strength and lack of honor. Rosamund watched, her heart in her throat, as the two men faced each other across the lists. The trumpet sounded, and the two knights spurred their horses forward, their lances lowered. The impact was deafening, the sound of splintering would echoing through the grounds. Rosamund gasped, her eyes wide with horror, as she saw Hugh's lance strike Sir Reginald squarely in the chest, unseating him with a sickening thud. Sir Reginald lay motionless on the ground, his armor dented and twisted. The crowd was silent, stunned by the violence of the impact. Rosamund felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She looked at Hugh, who had dismounted and was kneeling beside his fallen opponent. He removed his helmet, his face pale and drawn. He looked up at Rosamund, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and something else. Regret? Guilt? She wasn't sure. The crowd started to move and mutter. The victory felt hollow. It felt tainted. He had won, but at what cost? And what was Markham planning? The questions hung in the air. Chapter 6. Secrets of the Old Keep. The unsettling feeling that had taken root during the tournament deepened in the days that followed. While the Whitmore contingent had returned victorious, a palpable tension clung to the castle air. Hugh, though outwardly composed, seemed increasingly preoccupied, his gaze often drifting towards the distant hills, as if anticipating an unseen threat. Rosamund, too, felt a growing sense of unease, a premonition of impending danger. Driven by a need to understand the source of her anxieties, and perhaps to find some small measure of control in a situation that felt increasingly precarious, Rosamund began to explore the older, less frequented sections of Whitmore Castle. She had spent her childhood within its familiar walls, but there were parts of the ancient keep that remained largely unknown to her, shrouded in shadow and whispered stories. One afternoon, she found herself in a dusty, forgotten library, its shelves lined with crumbling tomes and forgotten scrolls. The air was thick with the scent of decaying parchment, and dust motes danced in the faint shafts of sunlight that penetrated the narrow windows. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books, her heart quickening with a sense of discovery. As she perused the shelves, her eye was caught by a small, leather-bound volume tucked away in a dark corner. It was unlike the other books in the library, its cover unadorned, its pages seemingly untouched by time. She carefully pulled it from the shelf, her fingers trembling slightly. The book had no title, but as she opened it, she realized it was a journal, its pages filled with the elegant script of a woman's hand. She began to read, her heart pounding in her chest as she recognized the name of the author. Lady Annalise of Whitmore, her great-grandmother. Annalise's journal chronicled a period of great turmoil and intrigue, a time when Whitmore had been under siege, not by a foreign army, but by a rival noble house, the Markhams. Rosamund read, captivated, as Annalise described the plots and counterplots, the betrayals and alliances that had shaped the history of her family. She learned of a secret passage, hidden within the walls of the castle, a passage that had been used by Annalise to smuggle messages and supplies to her loyal supporters. She also learned of a hidden chamber, a vault where Annalise had stored valuable documents and treasures, safe from the prying eyes of her enemies. Rosamund's heart raced as she realized the significance of her discovery. Annalise's journal was not just a historical record, it was a map, a guide to the secrets of Whitmore Castle. And those secrets, she suspected, might hold the key to understanding the current threat, the whispers of conspiracy that had so unsettled Hugh. She continued to read, her eyes scanning the pages, searching for clues. She found a detailed description of the secret passage, its entrance concealed behind a tapestry in the Great Hall, its exit leading to a hidden grove outside the castle walls. She also found a cryptic reference to the hidden chamber, its location described only as beneath the watchful eye of the lion. Rosamund closed the journal, her mind reeling. She knew she had to share her discovery with Hugh, but she also felt a sense of trepidation. She was stepping into a world of intrigue and danger, a world she had only glimpsed before. She was no longer the sheltered noblewoman, content to remain within the confines of her prescribed role. She was becoming a player in the game, a participant in the struggle for power that had shaped her family's destiny. She carefully replaced the journal on the shelf, her mind already racing ahead, planning her next move. She would find the secret passage, she would explore the hidden chamber, and she would uncover the truth about the Markham conspiracy. And she would do it with, or without Hugh's help. This resolve was new, powerful. It filled the core of her, and yet she could feel a shiver of doubt. Was she ready?
She didn't know, but she had to try.
The journal felt heavy, the secrets within heavier. Chapter 7. The Serpent's Kiss, a Conspiracy Unveiled. Armed with the knowledge gleaned from Annalise's journal, Rosamund resolved to act. That very evening, after the household had retired for the night, she crept into the great hall, a single flickering candle her only source of light. The vast chamber was silent and empty, the shadows dancing on the walls, creating an eerie, almost spectral atmosphere. She approached the tapestry that Annalise had described, a large, faded depiction of a hunting scene. Her heart pounded in her chest as she ran her fingers along the woven fabric, searching for the hidden mechanism that would reveal the entrance to the secret passage. After what seemed like an eternity, her fingers brushed against a small, concealed lever. She pressed it, and with a soft click, a section of the tapestry swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow opening. She held her breath, her candle casting a wavering circle of light into the darkness beyond. The passage was narrow and dusty, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Cobwebs brushed against her face as she made her way through the darkness, her candle casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. She could hear the faint scurrying of rats and the occasional drip of water, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. She followed the passage as it twisted and turned, descending deeper beneath the castle. She remembered Annalise's description and kept a careful count of her steps, turning where the journal had indicated. The air grew colder, and the silence became more profound, broken only by the sound of her own breathing and the faint echo of her footsteps. Finally, she reached the end of the passage. She found herself in a small, hidden chamber, its walls lined with shelves filled with dusty bottles and forgotten relics. This was not the vault Annalise had described, but a secret storeroom, perhaps used for provisions or as a meeting place. As she explored the chamber, her eye was caught by a small, wooden chest tucked away in a corner. She knelt beside it, her heart quickening with anticipation. The chest was locked, but the key was still in the lock, as if it had been left there in haste. She carefully turned the key, and with a soft click, the lid of the chest opened. Inside, she found a collection of rolled-up parchments tied with faded ribbons. She unrolled one of the parchments, her candle casting a flickering light on the words written upon it. It was a letter, written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. As she read, her blood ran cold. The letter was from Lord Markham to one of his spies within Whitmore Castle, outlining a detailed plan to assassinate Lord Elric and seize control of the estate. The spy was identified only as Serpent, a chilling codename that sent a shiver of fear down Rosamund's spine. She unrolled another parchment, and another, each one revealing more details of the plot. There were lists of names, coded messages, and instructions for carrying out the assassination. The conspiracy was far more extensive than she had imagined, involving not just Markham, but other disgruntled nobles, and even some members of the Whitmore household. As she read, she heard a faint noise behind her. She turned, her heart pounding in her chest, her candle almost slipping from her grasp. Standing in the doorway of the passage was Hugh, his face grim, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "What are you doing here, Rosamund?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Rosamund froze, her mind racing. She had been so engrossed in her discovery that she hadn't heard him approach. She knew she had to tell him the truth, but she also feared his reaction. I found something," she stammered, her voice trembling. She held up the parchments, her hand shaking. "A plot. To kill my father." Hugh's eyes widened in disbelief. He stepped into the chamber, his gaze fixed on the parchments. He took them from her, his fingers brushing against hers, sending a shiver of electricity through her. He unrolled the parchments, his eyes scanning the words. As he read, his expression darkened, his jaw clenching in anger. "Markham," he muttered, his voice filled with a cold fury. "I knew it." He looked at Rosamond, his gray-blue eyes filled with a mixture of concern and admiration. "You found this?" he asked, his voice softer now. Rosamond nodded, her eyes meeting his. "In an old journal. My great-grandmother's." Hugh's gaze shifted to the chest, then back to Rosamond. "You are braver than you know, Rosamond," he said, his voice filled with a newfound respect. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. His touch was warm and reassuring, sending a wave of comfort through her. "But you must be careful," he said, his voice low and urgent. "This is dangerous. You cannot trust anyone." Rosamond nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew he was right. She had stumbled upon a deadly secret, a secret that could cost her life. And the only person she knew to be true was the man in front of her, and she felt his truth. He, in turn, was struggling with her bravery and her recklessness. Where would this lead? Chapter 8. Beneath the Banners of War. The discovery of the assassination plot galvanized Hugh into action. He immediately alerted Lord Elric, who, though initially skeptical, was quickly convinced by the evidence Rosamond had uncovered. The castle was placed on high alert, guards were doubled, and suspected conspirators were quietly apprehended and questioned. The atmosphere within Whitmore became thick with suspicion and paranoia. No one knew who to trust, and whispers of betrayal echoed through the corridors. Rosamond found herself caught in the middle of the storm, her every move scrutinized, her loyalty questioned. Despite the danger, she felt a strange sense of exhilaration. She was no longer a passive observer, but an active participant in the struggle for her family's survival. She worked closely with Hugh, sharing her knowledge of the castle and its secrets, helping him to unravel the intricate web of Markham's conspiracy. One evening, as they were poring over the parchments in the secret chamber, Hugh revealed a crucial piece of information. "The serpent," he said, his voice low and grave, "is someone close to your father. Someone he trusts implicitly." Rosamond's heart sank. The thought that someone within her father's inner circle could be a traitor was deeply unsettling. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Hugh hesitated, his gaze meeting hers. "I do not know for certain," he said, "but I have my suspicions." He revealed that he had been observing the movements of several key members of the household, noting their comings and goings, their conversations, their interactions with others. He had identified a pattern of suspicious behavior, a series of clandestine meetings and coded messages that pointed to one person in particular, Lord Elric's longtime advisor, Master Alaric. Rosamond was shocked. Alaric had been a fixture in the Whitmore household for as long as she could remember. He was a learned man, a skilled negotiator, and a trusted confidant of her father. The idea that he could be a traitor seemed impossible, unthinkable. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling. Hugh nodded, his expression grim. "I have seen enough to convince me," he said. "But we need proof. Concrete evidence that we can present to your father." They decided to set a trap, a carefully orchestrated plan to expose Alaric's treachery. They would use Rosamond as bait, knowing that Alaric would be eager to silence her, to prevent her from revealing what she knew. The plan was risky, dangerous, but they saw no other option. They knew that Markham was growing impatient, that he would soon launch his attack. They had to act quickly, before it was too late. The following day, Rosamond deliberately let slip to Alaric that she had discovered evidence of the conspiracy, hinting that she knew the identity of the serpent. She watched him carefully, her heart pounding in her chest, as he reacted to her words. Alaric's expression was carefully controlled, but Rosamond saw a flicker of fear in his eyes, a subtle tightening of his jaw. He tried to dismiss her concerns, assuring her that she was mistaken, that there was no plot, but she persisted, pressing him for details, watching him squirm. That evening, under the pretense of a strategic council, Hugh summoned several key members of the guard, loyal men he had personally vetted. He and Rosamund presented their evidence, the parchments, and Hugh's observations of Alaric's suspicious behavior. The guards, initially skeptical, were gradually convinced. The trap was set. Under the cover of darkness, Alaric was lured to the secret chamber, where Rosamund pretended to be retrieving more evidence. As he approached her, his hand reaching for a dagger concealed beneath his cloak, the guards emerged from the shadows, surrounding him. He could feel them, surrounding him, their eyes burning. Alaric was caught red-handed, his treachery exposed. He was arrested, and the full extent of Markham's plot was revealed. War was inevitable. Banners were called. And Hugh, a knight once again called to protect and serve, and Rosamund, who stood in defiance, knew this was only the beginning. She saw the future, and it was bathed in blood. Chapter 9. A Promise Forged in Firelight. The revelation of Alaric's treachery and the imminent threat of war with Markham cast a long shadow over Whitmore. Preparations for battle were underway, the castle bustling with activity as men at arms sharpened weapons, provisioners stocked supplies, and messengers rode out to summon allies. The air was thick with tension, a mixture of fear and grim determination. Rosamund, though initially shaken by the speed of events, found a newfound strength within herself. She refused to be a passive bystander, instead immersing herself in the preparations, assisting where she could, offering comfort to the frightened servants, and working alongside the castle healer to prepare for the inevitable casualties. Hugh, meanwhile, was a whirlwind of activity, overseeing the defenses, drilling the troops, and strategizing with Lord Elric. He was in his element, a warrior born and bred, his calm demeanor and decisive actions inspiring confidence in those around him. Yet, Rosamund noticed the weariness in his eyes, the lines of strain around his mouth, a constant reminder of the burden he carried. One evening, after a long day of preparations, Rosamund found Hugh alone in the chapel, kneeling before the altar, his head bowed in prayer. She hesitated at the doorway, unsure whether to intrude on his solitude, but he sensed her presence and looked up, a faint smile touching his lips. "I did not expect to find you here, Sir Knight," she said, her voice soft. He rose, his chainmail glinting in the candlelight. "I come here often," he said, "to seek guidance and strength." Rosamund nodded, understanding. She had found solace in the chapel herself, in the quiet stillness, in the familiar rituals of prayer. "It is a heavy burden, this war," she said, her gaze meeting his. He sighed, his expression grave. "It is," he agreed. "But it is a burden we must bear. To protect our home, our people, our future." Rosamund felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of admiration for his dedication and fear for his safety. She knew that he would be at the forefront of the battle, risking his life to defend Whitmore. "You will be careful," she said, her voice trembling slightly. It was not a question, but a plea. He reached out, his hand gently touching her arm. His touch was warm and reassuring, sending a shiver of electricity through her. "I will," he said, his voice firm. "I promise you, Rosamund. I will return." His words, spoken with such conviction, gave her a measure of comfort, but she knew that promises made in the shadow of war were fragile, easily broken. As they stood there, in the flickering candlelight, the air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken emotions. Rosamund felt drawn to him, to his strength, to his vulnerability, to the quiet intensity that burned within him. She saw in his eyes a reflection of her own feelings, a growing affection, a bond forged in the crucible of shared danger. "There is something I must tell you, Rosamund," Hugh said, his voice low and hesitant. He paused, as if struggling to find the right words. "Something I should have told you long ago." Rosamund's heart quickened. She sensed that he was about to reveal something important, something that lay at the heart of his guarded demeanor. "Before Alara," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "before the betrayal, before the war that took everything from me, I made a vow of vengeance." Rosamund listened, her breath held captive in her chest. "I swore that I would hunt down those responsible for her death," he continued, his voice raw with pain, "that I would make them pay for their crimes. That vow has consumed me, Rosamond. It has driven me, guided me, blinded me. He looked at her, his gray-blue eyes filled with a mixture of regret and something else. Hope. But now, he said, his voice softer, now I see that there is more to life than vengeance. There is love. There is hope. There is you. Rosamund's heart soared. His words, so unexpected, so heartfelt, filled her with a joy she had never known before. She reached out, her hand taking his, her fingers intertwining with his. And I, you, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tentative kiss that sealed their unspoken promise. It was a kiss born of firelight and shadow, of war and hope, of a love that had blossomed in the face of adversity. It was a moment, pure, clear, and certain. A moment that, regardless of the future, would forever remain. And that was the promise of what was to come. Chapter 10. The Lady's Bold Gambit. The eve of battle arrived with a heavy, ominous silence. The castle was ready, its defenses fortified, its soldiers armed and prepared. But an undercurrent of fear ran through Whitmore, a palpable anxiety that settled like a shroud over everyone within its walls. Rosamund, despite her outward composure, felt it too, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She sought out Hugh, finding him on the battlements, gazing out at the gathering darkness. He was clad in his full armor, his sword at his side, a figure of grim determination against the twilight sky. They will come with the dawn, he said, his voice low and somber, not turning to face her. Rosamund nodded, her heart heavy. She knew that the coming battle would be brutal, a clash of steel and blood that would determine the fate of Whitmore. I fear for you, she said, her voice trembling slightly. He turned to her, his expression softening. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. Do not fear, Rosamund, he said. I will fight with all my strength. I will protect you and your family. His words, though meant to reassure, did little to ease her anxiety. She knew that war was unpredictable, that even the bravest knight could fall. As they stood there, a sudden thought struck Rosamund. She remembered Annalise's journal, the cryptic reference to the hidden chamber, its location described only as beneath the watchful eye of the lion. She realized, with a sudden flash of insight, what it meant. The Fitzalan family crest, the rearing lion that adorned Hugh's armor, his ring, the banners that flew above Whitmore, that was the key. The hidden chamber must be located somewhere beneath the main courtyard, where a large stone statue of a lion stood, a symbol of the Fitzalans' power and authority. She shared her revelation with Hugh, her voice filled with a mixture of excitement and urgency. I believe I know where the hidden chamber is, she said. The one Annalise wrote about. Hugh's eyes widened in surprise. Are you certain? He asked. Rosamund nodded. It's beneath the lion statue in the courtyard, she explained. Annalise said it was beneath the watchful eye of the lion. Hugh considered her words, his brow furrowed in thought. It is possible, he said. But why is this important now? We have more pressing concerns. Annalise wrote that she stored valuable documents and treasures there, Rosamund explained. Things that might be of use to us. Perhaps there are weapons or maps or something that could give us an advantage. Hugh was skeptical, but he also knew that they could not afford to ignore any potential advantage. He agreed to investigate, and together, they made their way to the courtyard, the darkness shrouding their movements. The courtyard was deserted, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind. The lion statue loomed large and imposing, its stone surface cold and smooth beneath Rosamund's fingertips. They searched the base of the statue, their hands probing for any sign of a hidden mechanism. After what seemed like an eternity, Hugh's fingers brushed against a small, almost imperceptible indentation. He pressed it, and with a grinding sound, a section of the stone base slid open, revealing a narrow, descending staircase. They exchanged a look, a mixture of excitement and trepidation in their eyes. They had found the entrance to the hidden chamber. Rosamund felt a thrill, but also fear. What lay beneath? She insisted to go with Hugh, even though he protested. He could stop the wind from blowing before he could prevent her, and he knew it. Together, they descended. Chapter 11. Echoes of a Lost Love. The staircase led down into a cold, damp passage, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Hugh held a torch aloft, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. The silence was profound, broken only by the drip of water and the faint echo of their footsteps. They reached the bottom of the stairs and found themselves in a small, circular chamber. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with dusty relics, forgotten weapons, and decaying tapestries. In the center of the chamber stood a large, ornately carved wooden chest, its surface covered in intricate designs. Rosamund's heart quickened as she recognized the chest from Annalise's description. This was the vault, the repository of Whitmore's hidden treasures. Hugh approached the chest, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He carefully examined the lock, then drew a small key from a pouch at his belt. The key, he explained, had been passed down through the FitzAlan line, its purpose forgotten until now. He inserted the key into the lock, and with a click, the chest opened. Inside, they found a collection of objects, some valuable, some seemingly mundane, all imbued with the weight of history. There were ancient weapons, swords and axes, their blades still sharp despite their age. There were rolled-up parchments, maps and documents, detailing the defenses of Whitmore and the surrounding lands. And there were jewels, gold and silver coins and other treasures, remnants of Whitmore's past glory. But there was one object that caught Rosamund's eye, a small, intricately carved wooden box, nestled amongst the other treasures. She carefully lifted it out, her fingers tracing the delicate carvings on its surface. She opened the box, and inside, she found a single object, a locket, made of silver, shaped like a heart. She opened the locket, and her breath caught in her throat. Inside, there were 2 miniature portraits, one of a beautiful woman with dark hair and piercing eyes, the other of a young man with a familiar, haunted gaze. Rosamund recognized the man immediately. It was Hugh, younger, less scarred, but unmistakably him. And the woman, it must be Alara, his lost love. She looked at Hugh, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. He had been carrying this locket, this reminder of his past, all this time. Hugh saw the locket in her hand, and his expression changed. He looked away, his jaw clenching, his eyes filled with a pain that Rosamund could only imagine. I found it amongst my father's belongings after he died, he said, his voice hoarse. I had forgotten about it. Rosamund closed the locket, her fingers lingering on its smooth surface. She understood now, more than ever, the depth of his grief, the burden of his past. She was beautiful, she said softly, her voice filled with compassion. Hugh nodded, his gaze still averted. She was, he said. She was everything. He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. But that was a long time ago, he said. Before you. Rosamund felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of gratitude, and something else. Love? She wasn't sure. She only knew that in that moment, in the cold, damp chamber, surrounded by the echoes of the past, she felt closer to him than ever before. She reached out, her hand taking his, her fingers intertwining with his. The past is a part of us, she said, her voice firm. But it does not define us. We can choose our future, Hugh. We can choose love. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the sincerity in her gaze, the unwavering strength that had blossomed within her. He saw the woman he had come to love, the woman who had shown him that there was still hope, still beauty, still a reason to fight. He leaned in and kissed. The kiss was charged. It was acceptance and recognition. It was the present and a promise for the future. But the future arrived quickly in the form of a distant horn blast. The battle had begun. They had to leave. Chapter 12. The Price of Loyalty. The sound of the war horn shattered the intimacy of the moment, pulling them back to the harsh reality of the impending battle. Hugh and Rosamund exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of the danger that awaited them. They quickly gathered what they could from the hidden chamber, the ancient weapons, the maps, and a small, leather-bound book that Rosamund recognized as Annalise's personal prayer book. They emerged from the hidden chamber, the sounds of battle now clearly audible, the clash of steel, the shouts of men, the thunder of hooves. The courtyard was no longer deserted, it was a scene of controlled chaos. As soldiers rushed to their positions, archers took aim from the battlements, and Lord Elric, clad in his armor, rallied his troops. Hugh immediately joined his men, his presence a source of reassurance and leadership. Rosamund, though urged to seek safety within the castle walls, refused to be confined. She found her place beside the castle healer, assisting in the preparation of bandages and medicines, her hands steady despite the tremor in her heart. The battle raged throughout the day, a brutal, bloody affair that tested the strength and resilience of both sides. From her vantage point within the castle, Rosamund could see the ebb and flow of the fighting, the banners of Whitmore and Markham clashing amidst the chaos. She saw men fall, heard their cries of pain, and felt a growing sense of despair. As the day wore on, news from the battlefield became increasingly grim. Markham's forces were larger and better equipped than anticipated, and they were slowly gaining ground. The Whitmore defenders were fighting bravely, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. Rosamund worked tirelessly, tending to the wounded, offering comfort to the dying, her hands stained with blood, her heart heavy with sorrow. She saw the toll the battle was taking, not just on the soldiers, but on the entire household. Fear and desperation were etched on every face. Late in the afternoon, a messenger arrived, bearing dire news. Lord Elric had been gravely wounded, struck by an arrow while leading a charge against the enemy. He had been carried back to the castle, but his condition was critical. Rosamund's heart sank. She rushed to her father's side, finding him lying in his bedchamber, his face pale and drawn, his breathing shallow and labored. The castle healer was attending to him, but his expression was grave. Rosamund knelt beside her father, taking his hand in hers. His grip was weak, but she felt a faint squeeze, a sign that he was still fighting. "Father," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You must be strong. You must live." Lord Elric opened his eyes, his gaze focusing on Rosamund. He tried to speak, but his voice was barely a whisper. "Rosamund, my daughter Whitmore," he struggled to breathe, his body racked with pain. Rosamund leaned closer, her tears falling onto his hand. I am proud of you," he whispered, his voice fading. "You are strong like your mother." His grip on her hand loosened, and his eyes closed. Rosamund felt a wave of grief wash over her, a pain so intense that it threatened to consume her. Her father, the man who had always been her protector, her guide, was gone. The healer confirmed what Rosamund already knew. Lord Elric was dead. The weight of her loss, combined with the imminent threat of Markham's victory, was almost unbearable. But she knew she could not give in to despair. She had a responsibility, a duty to her family, to her people, to Whitmore. She rose, her legs trembling, her heart aching, but her resolve firm. She would not let her father's death be in vain. She would fight on, in his memory, for the future of Whitmore. She looked to the door, knowing Hugh was out there, and wondering, was it her turn to worry?
To fear?
The price of loyalty was steep, and she knew it was far from being paid in full. Chapter 13. Across the storm-racked moors. With Lord Elric's death, the command of Whitmore's forces fell to Hugh. He was a natural leader, his courage and tactical acumen inspiring the remaining soldiers to fight on, despite their dwindling numbers and the growing sense of hopelessness. Rosamund, though consumed by grief, forced herself to remain strong, supporting Hugh in every way she could, providing counsel, tending to the wounded, and maintaining morale within the castle walls. As night fell, the battle reached a stalemate. Markham's forces, though still superior in numbers, had been unable to breach Whitmore's defenses. Both sides were exhausted, their ranks depleted, their spirits weary. Hugh, realizing that a prolonged siege would be disastrous for Whitmore, decided to take a desperate gamble. He proposed a daring plan, to lead a small, elite force through the secret passage that Rosamund had discovered, bypassing Markham's main army and launching a surprise attack on their rear flank. It was a risky maneuver, fraught with danger, but it was their only hope of turning the tide of the battle. Rosamund, though terrified for Hugh's safety, understood the necessity of the plan. She offered her knowledge of the passage, guiding Hugh and his men through the dark, winding tunnels beneath the castle. They emerged from the passage in the hidden grove outside the castle walls, under the cover of darkness. The air was cold and damp, the wind howling through the trees, mirroring the storm that raged within Rosamund's heart. Hugh turned to her, his face grim but resolute. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "It is too dangerous for you to come any further." Rosamund wanted to protest, to beg him to let her stay by his side, but she knew he was right. She would only be a hindrance in the coming fight. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice trembling.
Please come back to me.
He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "I will," he said, his voice firm. "I promise you, Rosamund. I will return." He kissed her then, a fierce, desperate kiss that spoke of love and longing, of fear and hope. It was a kiss that would have to sustain her, a kiss that would have to last. Then, he turned and led his men into the darkness, disappearing into the swirling mist that blanketed the moors. Rosamund watched them go, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes filled with tears. She felt utterly alone, her fate, and the fate of Whitmore, hanging in the balance. She waited in the grove, the hours stretching into an eternity. The sounds of battle echoed in the distance, a constant reminder of the struggle that was taking place. She prayed, fervently, desperately, for Hugh's safety, for the survival of Whitmore. As dawn approached, the storm that had been brewing all night finally broke. Rain lashed down, driven by a fierce wind, turning the moors into a treacherous landscape. Rosamund huddled beneath the shelter of a large oak tree, shivering with cold and fear. She did not know how long she waited, her senses strained, listening for any sign of Hugh's return. The storm raged on, the wind howling like a banshee, the rain blurring her vision. She felt a growing sense of despair, a fear that she would never see Hugh again. Just when she thought she could bear it no longer, she saw a figure emerge from the mist, his silhouette barely visible against the stormy sky. It was Hugh. He was alive. He was alone. Where were the others? What had happened? The questions were a cold, harsh wind on her face, even worse than the storm. Chapter 14. A Hidden Sanctuary. A Shared Prayer. Hugh stumbled towards Rosamund, his armor battered and blood-stained, his face pale and drawn. He was clearly exhausted, his movements slow and labored. Rosamund rushed to meet him, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and dread. "Hugh!" she cried, her voice barely audible above the roar of the storm. "What happened? Where are the others?" He collapsed into her arms, his weight almost knocking her off her feet. He was breathing heavily, his body trembling. "Gone," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "All gone," ambushed. Rosamund's heart sank. She understood now. Hugh's daring plan had failed. His men had been slaughtered, and he had barely escaped with his life. She helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as they struggled back towards the hidden entrance to the passage. The storm raged around them, the wind and rain making it difficult to see or hear. They finally reached the entrance, and Rosamund quickly opened the secret door, pulling Hugh inside. They were safe from the storm, but the danger was far from over. They were trapped, alone, with Markham's forces still besieging the castle. They made their way back through the passage, emerging into the hidden chamber beneath the courtyard. Hugh collapsed onto the floor, his strength utterly depleted. Rosamund knelt beside him, tending to his wounds. He had several cuts and bruises, but thankfully, nothing life-threatening. She cleaned his wounds with water from a flask she had brought with her and bandaged them with strips of cloth torn from her gown. As she worked, she tried to piece together what had happened. Hugh, his voice weak and halting, explained that they had been betrayed. Someone within Whitmore had informed Markham of their plan, leading to the ambush. The realization that they were still surrounded by enemies, even within the castle walls, filled Rosamund with a chilling fear. But she also felt a surge of determination. She would not give up. She would not let Hugh down. They spent the rest of the night in the hidden chamber, huddled together for warmth and comfort. The storm gradually subsided, and a fragile silence descended, broken only by the sound of their breathing. As dawn approached, Rosamund suggested that they seek refuge in the chapel. It was a sacred place, a sanctuary where they might find some measure of peace and protection. Hugh, though weakened, agreed. They made their way through the deserted corridors of the castle, avoiding the areas where Markham's soldiers were likely to be. They reached the chapel, its stained glass windows casting colorful patterns on the stone floor. The air was still and quiet, scented with the lingering fragrance of incense. They knelt before the altar, their hands clasped together. Rosamund began to pray, her voice soft but fervent, her words echoing in the silence. She prayed for strength, for guidance, for deliverance. Hugh joined her in prayer, his voice hoarse but filled with emotion. He prayed for forgiveness, for redemption, for a chance to make amends for his past. As they prayed, Rosamund felt a sense of peace settle over her, a calmness that transcended the fear and uncertainty that surrounded them. She felt a connection to Hugh, a bond forged in shared adversity, in shared faith. They remained in the chapel for a long time, drawing strength from each other, finding solace in their shared prayer. The world outside was still filled with danger, but within the walls of the chapel, they found a sanctuary, a haven of peace in the midst of the storm. It was fragile and would soon be tested. But for now, it was enough. They were together. That was all that mattered for this brief moment. The next moments would be the true challenge. Chapter 15. The King's Decree, a Test of Faith. The fragile peace of the chapel was shattered by the sudden arrival of a messenger, a young, frightened-looking boy who burst through the doors, his face pale and streaked with tears. "My lady, Sir Knight," he cried, his voice trembling. "The castle, it has fallen." Rosamund and Hugh exchanged a look of horror. They had hoped that the remaining Whitmore forces might hold out until help arrived, but it seemed their hopes were dashed. "What happened?" Hugh asked, his voice grim. The boy explained that Markham's forces, aided by treachery from within, had managed to breach the main gate. The remaining defenders had been overwhelmed, and the castle was now under Markham's control. "They are searching for you," the boy continued, his eyes wide with fear. "Markham has sworn to make an example of you both." Rosamund felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that Markham was a cruel and ruthless man, and that he would show them no mercy. Hugh rose to his feet, his expression determined. "We must escape," he said. "We cannot let Markham capture us." But Rosamund hesitated. "Where can we go?" she asked. "We are surrounded." Hugh considered their options, his brow furrowed in thought. He knew that they could not remain in the castle, and that their chances of escaping through the secret passage were slim. Suddenly, a thought struck him. He remembered a conversation he had had with Lord Elric months before the wedding, about a secret alliance with a neighboring lord, Lord Gareth of Eldoria. Gareth was a loyal supporter of the king, and a known enemy of Markham. "Eldoria," Hugh said, his voice filled with a sudden hope. "We must seek refuge with Lord Gareth. He is our only hope." It was a long and perilous journey to Eldoria, across treacherous terrain, with Markham's forces searching for them. But they had no other choice. They left the chapel, creeping through the deserted corridors of the castle, avoiding the areas where Markham's soldiers were likely to be. They reached the stables, where they managed to find 2 horses that had not been taken by the invaders. They rode out of the castle under the cover of darkness, slipping past the unsuspecting guards. They headed north, towards Eldoria, their hearts pounding with fear and hope. The journey was arduous, a constant test of their endurance and resilience. They traveled by night, hiding by day, avoiding roads and villages, their supplies dwindling, their bodies weary. As they rode, they learned from a passing farmer, one loyal to the old ways, that a royal decree had been issued. The king, alerted to Markham's treachery, had declared him an outlaw and had dispatched a force to apprehend him. This news gave them a glimmer of hope. If they could reach Eldoria and join forces with Lord Gareth, they might be able to rally support and reclaim Whitmore. But the journey was far from over. They still had to evade Markham's patrols, cross the treacherous mountains that separated them from Eldoria, and convince Lord Gareth to aid them. Their trial of faith continued, with no certainty ahead. Chapter 16. Treachery at the Midnight Hour. The journey to Eldoria tested Rosamund and Hugh to their limits. They rode for days, pushing their horses and themselves to the brink of exhaustion. They faced constant danger, narrowly avoiding Markham's patrols, navigating treacherous terrain, and enduring hunger and thirst. The landscape mirrored their internal struggles, rugged, unforgiving, and filled with hidden dangers. One evening, as they were camped in a dense forest, their meager fire providing little warmth against the encroaching cold, they were startled by the sound of approaching horses. They quickly doused the fire, their hearts pounding in their chests, fearing that Markham's men had finally caught up with them. But it was not Markham's men. It was a small band of riders, clad in the colors of Eldoria. They were led by a tall, stern-looking knight, his face weathered and scarred, his eyes sharp and intelligent. "Who are you?" the knight demanded, his voice commanding. "And what is your business in Eldoria?" Hugh stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "I am Sir Hugh Fitzallen," he said, "and this is Lady Rosamund of Whitmore. We seek refuge with Lord Gareth." The knight's expression changed, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Fitzallen?" he said. "Whitmore? I have heard of your plight. Lord Gareth has been expecting you." Relief washed over Rosamund and Hugh. They had finally reached Eldoria, and it seemed their hopes of finding sanctuary were about to be realized. The knight, who introduced himself as Sir Callan, Lord Gareth's captain of the guard, escorted them to Eldoria Castle, a formidable fortress perched atop a high cliff overlooking a vast valley. They were brought before Lord Gareth, a powerful, imposing man with a keen mind and a reputation for justice and loyalty. He greeted them warmly, offering them food, shelter, and his protection. Hugh explained their situation, detailing Markham's treachery, the fall of Whitmore, and the king's decree. Lord Gareth listened intently, his expression grave. "Markham is a viper," he said, his voice filled with contempt. "He has long coveted Whitmore, and he has used this opportunity to seize it. But he will not succeed. The king has spoken, and I will stand by his decree." Lord Gareth pledged his support to Rosamund and Hugh, promising to provide them with troops and resources to help them reclaim Whitmore. He also informed them that the king's forces were already on their way, and that a major battle was imminent. Rosamund and Hugh were overjoyed. They had found an ally, a powerful friend who would help them fight for their home, for their future. But their relief was short-lived. That night, as they slept in their chambers in Eldoria Castle, Rosamund was awakened by a strange noise. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, her senses alert. She saw a figure standing in the shadows, a dark silhouette against the faint moonlight that filtered through the window. The figure was holding a dagger, its blade gleaming menacingly. Rosamund screamed, and Hugh awoke instantly, leaping from his bed, his sword in hand. The figure lunged at Rosamund, but Hugh was faster. He intercepted the attacker, his sword clashing against the dagger. A fierce struggle ensued, the two men grappling in the darkness. Rosamund watched in horror, her hands clasped to her mouth, her screams echoing through the chamber. Hugh, though still weakened from his previous injuries, fought with the strength of desperation. He managed to disarm the attacker, pinning him to the floor, his sword at his throat. The attacker was revealed to be Sir Callan, Lord Gareth's captain of the guard. The man they had trusted, the man who had escorted them to Eldoria, was a traitor. Betrayal was a cruel blade, one that twisted deep. Where would they turn to now? The night was dark, and the answers were darker. Chapter 17. The Lioness Rises. The revelation of Sir Callan's treachery sent shockwaves through Eldoria Castle. Lord Gareth was furious, his trust betrayed, his sense of justice outraged. He immediately ordered Kaelin's imprisonment and interrogated him mercilessly, demanding to know the extent of his involvement with Markham. Kaelin, realizing that his plot had failed, confessed everything. He revealed that he had been secretly working for Markham for years, feeding him information, sabotaging Eldoria's defenses, and plotting to assassinate Lord Gareth. Markham had promised him riches and power in exchange for his loyalty. The discovery of this betrayal within his own ranks shook Lord Gareth deeply, but it also strengthened his resolve to defeat Markham. He renewed his pledge of support to Rosamund and Hugh, assuring them that he would not be deterred by treachery. In the wake of Kaelin's betrayal and ahead of the king's forces, Rosamund found herself taking on a more prominent role. She was no longer just a lady seeking refuge, but a key player in the struggle for Whitmore. She used her knowledge of the castle and its surroundings to advise Lord Gareth and Hugh on their military strategy. She also rallied the women of Eldoria, organizing them to provide support for the troops, preparing supplies, tending to the wounded, and bolstering morale. She discovered within herself a strength and a resilience she never knew she possessed. She was the daughter of Lord Elric, the wife of Sir Hugh Fitzalan, the Lady of Whitmore. She would not stand idly by while her home was ravaged by a traitor. She would fight, not with a sword, but with her wit, her courage, and her unwavering determination. One evening, as she was working alongside the other women, preparing bandages and medicines, she overheard a conversation between two of Lord Gareth's advisors. They were discussing the upcoming battle, expressing doubts about their chances of success. Markham's forces are too strong, one of them said. They have the advantage of numbers, and they control Whitmore Castle. We are fighting a losing battle, the other agreed. We should sue for peace before it is too late. Rosamund, hearing their words, felt a surge of anger. She could not allow this defeatist attitude to spread. She stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "We will not surrender," she declared. "We will not give up hope. Whitmore is our home, and we will fight for it, to the very last breath." Her words, spoken with such passion and conviction, silenced the advisors. They looked at her, surprised by her boldness, by her unwavering determination. "Lady Rosamund is right," one of the other women said. "We cannot give up. We must fight for our families, for our future." Others joined in, their voices rising in agreement. Rosamund's words had ignited a spark of hope, a renewed sense of purpose. From that moment on, Rosamund became a symbol of resistance, a rallying point for the people of Eldoria. She was no longer just a lady, she was a leader, a warrior in her own right. She was the lioness, rising to defend her pride. She had found a voice, a power. The upcoming battle, though daunting, now had a new champion. One that would not falter. One that stood not behind a knight, but beside. Chapter 18. Scars of the Heart, Bonds of Steel. The arrival of the king's forces, a formidable army clad in shining armor, their banners bearing the royal crest, bolstered the spirits of the Eldoria troops and further solidified the alliance against Markham. The combined armies, led by Lord Gareth and Hugh, with Rosamund a constant presence at their councils, prepared for the final confrontation. The battle for Whitmore was fought on the open plains before the castle walls, a clash of steel and blood that would determine the fate of the region. Rosamund, though urged to remain within the safety of Eldoria's fortifications, insisted on being present, watching from a nearby hill, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She watched as Hugh, clad in his Fitzalan armor, his lion crest gleaming in the sunlight, led the charge against Markham's forces. He fought with a ferocity and a skill that she had only glimpsed before, his every movement a testament to his years of training and his unwavering commitment to reclaiming his home. The battle raged for hours, a brutal, chaotic affair that tested the strength and courage of both sides. Rosamund watched, her hands clenched tightly, her eyes fixed on Hugh, her heart aching with every blow he struck, with every near miss. She saw the ebb and flow of the fighting, the banners rising and falling, the cries of victory and defeat echoing across the plains. She saw men fall, their lives cut short by the cruel hand of war. And she saw the scars of battle, not just on the bodies of the soldiers, but on the landscape itself, the earth torn and bloodied, a testament to the price of conflict. As the day wore on, the tide of the battle began to turn. The king's forces, combined with the Eldoria troops, slowly gained ground, pushing Markham's army back towards the castle walls. Rosamund saw Hugh, his face grim and determined, leading a final, decisive charge. He broke through Markham's lines, his sword flashing in the sunlight, his voice ringing out above the din of battle. She saw Markham, his face contorted with rage and desperation, confronting Hugh. The two men clashed, their swords meeting in a shower of sparks. It was a duel of destinies, a fight to the death between two men bound by hatred and ambition. Rosamund held her breath, her heart in her throat, as she watched the two men fight. She saw Hugh, his movements swift and precise, his every blow aimed with deadly accuracy. She saw Markham, his strength waning, his defenses crumbling. Finally, with a mighty blow, Hugh disarmed Markham, sending his sword flying through the air. He stood over his fallen enemy, his sword poised to strike the final blow. But he hesitated. Rosamund saw the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between vengeance and mercy. He had vowed to avenge Alara's death, to make Markham pay for his crimes. But he also knew that killing Markham in cold blood would not bring Alara back, nor would it erase the scars of his past. He lowered his sword, his expression softening. "It is over, Markham," he said, his voice hoarse. "Your treachery is defeated." Markham, his face filled with a mixture of fear and defiance, was taken prisoner. The battle was over. Whitmore had been reclaimed. Rosamund rushed to Hugh's side, her heart overflowing with relief and joy. She embraced him, her tears falling onto his blood-stained armor. "You did it," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You saved us." He held her close, his arms tight around her. "We did it, Rosamund," he said, his voice filled with a newfound peace. Together. The scars of battle, both physical and emotional, remained. But so too did the bonds of steel, forged in the heat of conflict, tempered by shared adversity. They had won, but it was a victory that knew loss. It knew sacrifice. And those scars and bonds would always remain. Chapter 19. Redemption in the Valley of Shadows. The aftermath of the battle was a time of both celebration and mourning. Whitmore was reclaimed, its banners once again flying proudly above the castle walls, but the cost of victory was heavy. Many lives had been lost, both soldiers and civilians, and the castle itself bore the scars of the siege. Rosamund and Hugh worked tirelessly to restore order, tending to the wounded, comforting the bereaved, and rebuilding the shattered community. They were hailed as heroes, their courage and leadership inspiring hope and resilience in the hearts of their people. Markham was brought before the king, who, after a swift trial, sentenced him to life imprisonment. His lands and titles were stripped from him, and his name was forever stained with the mark of treachery. Justice, though delayed, had finally been served. With Whitmore secure and Markham's threat extinguished, Hugh finally turned his attention to the personal demons that had haunted him for so long. He had carried the burden of Alara's death, the guilt and the thirst for vengeance, for years. But now, with Rosamund by his side, he felt ready to confront his past and find a measure of peace. One day, he and Rosamund rode out to the valley where Alara had been killed, a place he had avoided for years, a place that held only painful memories. They stood together, hand in hand, gazing out at the peaceful landscape, the sun setting, casting long shadows across the valley. "This is where it happened," Hugh said, his voice hoarse, his eyes filled with a sadness that Rosamund knew would never fully disappear. Rosamund squeezed his hand, offering him silent support. She knew that this was a difficult moment for him, a crucial step in his journey towards healing. "She loved this place," Hugh continued, his voice barely a whisper. "She used to come here often, to escape the confines of the castle, to feel the wind in her hair, to be free." He closed his eyes for a moment, as if reliving a cherished memory. Then he opened them again, his gaze meeting Rosamund's. "I have carried her memory with me for so long," he said, "a burden of grief and guilt. But now I realize that she would not want me to live in the shadows. She would want me to be happy, to find love again, to live." Rosamund felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of gratitude and love for this man who had endured so much, who had emerged from the darkness with his spirit unbroken. "And I have found that, Rosamund," he said, his voice filled with a newfound tenderness. "I have found love again with you." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was both passionate and gentle, a kiss that spoke of healing and hope, of a future free from the shadows of the past. It was a redemption, not just of a castle, but of a heart. A redemption earned not through vengeance, but through love, through forgiveness, through the willingness to embrace a new beginning. The valley, once a place of sorrow, was now a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, the ability to find light even in the darkest of times. It was a moment of closure and a beginning. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. With peace restored and Whitmore rebuilt, Rosamund and Hugh settled into their roles as Lord and Lady, their lives intertwined with the responsibilities of leadership and the quiet joys of their growing love. They ruled wisely and justly, earning the respect and affection of their people. They worked to heal the wounds of war, to rebuild the shattered community, and to create a future of peace and prosperity. But their journey was not without its challenges. The scars of the past, both physical and emotional, remained. Hugh still struggled with nightmares, with moments of doubt and guilt. Rosamund, too, carried the weight of her father's death, the memory of the siege, the constant awareness of the fragility of life. They faced these challenges together, drawing strength from each other, their love a constant source of comfort and support. They learned to navigate the complexities of their relationship, to balance the demands of duty with the needs of their hearts. One spring morning, several months after the battle, Rosamund found herself in the castle gardens, tending to the roses that had been her mother's pride and joy. She felt a familiar stirring within her, a sense of hope and anticipation. She had missed her monthly courses, and a quiet certainty had taken root within her heart. She sought out Hugh, finding him in the training yard, instructing the young squires in the art of swordsmanship. He looked up as she approached, his face breaking into a smile, his eyes filled with a love that made her heart soar. She took his hand, leading him away from the bustle of the yard, to a quiet corner of the gardens, beneath the shade of an ancient oak tree. "Hugh," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her, his expression filled with concern. "What is it, Rosamund? Are you unwell?" She smiled, her eyes shining with a joy she could no longer contain. "I am with child," she said. "We are going to have a baby." Hugh's face lit up with a mixture of surprise and elation. He reached out, his hands gently cupping her belly, as if to feel the new life growing within her. "A child," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Our child." He embraced her, holding her close, his tears mingling with hers. It was a moment of pure joy, a testament to the enduring power of love, a promise of a future filled with hope and new beginnings. The reckoning of love and duty had come full circle. They had faced war, betrayal, loss, and grief. They had emerged stronger, their love tested and tempered, their bond unbreakable. They had built a life together, a life rooted in duty, in responsibility, but also in love, in companionship, in the shared joy of creating a family. The future was uncertain, as it always is. But they knew, with absolute certainty, that they would face it together, hand in hand, their hearts united, their love a beacon of hope in a world that often seemed dark and unpredictable. The future held a child, a legacy, a new dawn. Epilogue. Years passed, and Whitmore flourished under the wise and just rule of Rosamund and Hugh. Their child, a son named Elric after Rosamund's father, grew into a strong and noble young man, embodying the best qualities of both his parents. He was followed by 2 daughters, Annalise and Alara, their names honoring the women who had shaped their family's history. Rosamund and Hugh watched their children grow, their hearts filled with pride and love. They saw in them the promise of a brighter future, a future free from the shadows of the past. They had built a legacy, not just of power and wealth, but of love, of courage, of resilience. The scars of war eventually faded, both on the land and in the hearts of the people. Whitmore was rebuilt, stronger and more prosperous than before. The memory of Markham's treachery served as a constant reminder of the importance of vigilance, of loyalty, of the enduring power of good over evil. Hugh, though he never fully escaped the nightmares of his past, found peace in his family, in his duty, in the love that surrounded him. He became a wise and respected leader, known for his courage, his compassion, and his unwavering commitment to justice. Rosamund, too, blossomed in her role as Lady of Whitmore. She was no longer the sheltered, obedient noblewoman she had once been. She was a strong, independent woman, a leader in her own right, a loving wife and mother, a pillar of her community. One evening, as the sun set over the rolling hills surrounding Whitmore, Rosamund and Hugh stood together on the battlements, their hands clasped, their gazes fixed on the horizon. They were older now, their hair streaked with silver, their faces lined with the marks of time and experience. But their love for each other remained as strong and true as ever. "We have come a long way, Rosamund," Hugh said, his voice soft, his eyes filled with a love that transcended time and circumstance. Rosamund nodded, her heart overflowing with gratitude. "We have," she agreed. "And we have done it together." They stood there in silence, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. They had faced many challenges, endured many hardships, but they had always found their way back to each other, their love a guiding light in the darkness. They knew that the future would hold its own challenges, its own joys and sorrows. But they also knew that they would face them together, their love a constant source of strength and comfort, their bond unbreakable. They were bound by duty, by loyalty, by the shared experiences that had shaped their lives. But most of all, they were bound by love, a love that had blossomed in the face of adversity, a love that had endured the test of time, a love that would last for eternity. Their story was one that began and continued with love. From hesitant whispers, to war and loss, and finally, to many years of quiet, shared sunsets.
It was a good life.
AF.